thank you all for having me. And yeah, I think the comment I was looking at the number of people going, oh, it must be raining in New Zealand. I'm actually not in New Zealand at the moment, but yeah, it's so good to see you all on a nice day. And yeah, it's hard to be inside in front of a screen, but hopefully I'll be able to present something that will hold your interest. So yeah, I'm Brian Cutting. I'm an entomologist. I work professionally with plant and food research, which is one of the New Zealand Crown Research Institutes. And I mostly work on crop pollination. And I've been in this part of the world for 10 years now. So yeah, Jackie pointed out that that I presented at the conference 10 years ago, and that kind of blew my mind that 10 years have passed. I don't know if any of you remember that conference. If you didn't remember my talk, it was certainly memorable to me because we had an earthquake in the middle of it, didn't we? But yeah, it's been a few years, and a lot has changed, but a lot's still going on. So I guess with that, I'll get right into it here. Yeah, this is a new talk for me. I've been putting it together over the last few days. So bear with me because this is actually like my first time running through it, but hopefully I'll remember where we're headed. And yeah, so we titled it Backyard Biodiversity and Ecosystem Function. So I really want to sort of hit on why what we're doing, you know, everyone in this room has an interest in this stuff, but sort of put some context into why it matters. And I said it would be a scientist's personal perspective because I'll go a little bit into the data and whatnot, but it is Sunday. In my spare time, I'm an insect photographer. So I guess I just wanted to share some of the beautiful things as well. Yeah, for me, sitting on a sunny day and looking at a bunch of graphs can be very interesting, but that's not what this talk is going to be. So if you wanted some hardcore science, it's out there and I'll point you in the right direction. But this talk is going to be heavy on the photos, so I hope that's okay. So yeah, in the last 10 years since we last presented, there has been a lot of changes in how we talk about insect populations, how we talk about the world. Everyone in this room will know that we're facing some pretty serious challenges as a species and as a planet. We see news about climate change every day. New Zealand is fresh off the back of an unprecedented set of storms, and we're starting to see what the human cost, what the economic cost is of the changes that are happening. So yeah, it's interesting times. You may have seen news stories about the insect Armageddon. There's been a bit of a splash around declines in insect populations, and the challenge there is that it's actually really difficult to accurately measure changes in insect populations. As we all know, they're extremely variable and can change in response to weather events. It's normal to have big swings from year to year in insect populations, and different species, different insects globally are going to be affected by different processes. So yeah, it's sort of early days from a science perspective on how do we quantify how insects are doing broadly. Things like, is it appropriate to count mosquitoes when we talk about insect decline? Is it appropriate to count a few pest insects that are doing really well because they like corn or soybeans? So how to measure this and how to define it on a global context is really quite difficult. But there are a few studies, particularly when you drill down into certain groups of insects. There's a number of studies out of Europe and the US showing declines in bumblebees. Throughout Europe, there's a number of studies sort of generally showing that there's a decline in insect, either abundance or number of species throughout Europe. And that's not terribly surprising given what we know about other animals. We see that in vertebrates, so in birds and mammals, generally there's been a decline of about 1/3 in their numbers and the area of the surface area of planet that they occupy. So that's a major decline in the last 50 years or so. In terms of frogs, amphibians are really alarming. We're showing declines of about 1/2. So understanding that measuring insect decline is quite complex, there's sort of a consensus seems to be growing that we're looking at declines of around 1 to 2% per annum in insects. And that's not quite as alarming as 50%, but when we consider how important insects are to our own survival, that's quite scary. In a Aotearoa, New Zealand specific context, there are very, very few studies that are long-term enough with consistent measuring enough to really say what's happening to our insect populations here. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that some things may be in decline, and that's not to say that anecdotes aren't useful, but we just don't have the data to say for sure what's happening in Aotearoa. Where's my, there we are. So when we talk about those 1 to 2% declines, there's a whole lot of stuff that's causing that, and it's not that hard for this group to imagine that. So there was a paper in 2021 that sort of summarized the existing literature on insect declines, and they made this really nice, or I don't know, it's quite dire really, but a nice figure of all the sorts of things that we think are driving insect declines. And when I looked at this, there's sort of 3 or 4 together that would get lumped under land use change. And that's something that we're going to talk quite a bit about today. There's clearly all these things matter, but when we talk about deforestation, when we talk about insecticides, intensification of agriculture, and even some of the sort of introduced species dynamics, a lot of that is about how we use the land for ourselves and how that impacts the creatures that are around us. So one of the ways that we try to overcome these declines is by setting aside protected areas, conservation areas, national parks, and whatnot. And this is actually a really just published a few weeks ago by some familiar colleagues across the river here in Brisbane at the University of Queensland. And they looked at insect species ranges globally and sort of matched it up with protected areas around the world. And what they found was that 76% of insect species weren't adequately covered by those protected areas. That doesn't mean that they didn't have some presence in protected areas, and most insects had some of their population covered in protected areas, but there was 2% of insects that weren't covered by any protected area, and the far and away most species didn't have enough protected area that we would consider it an effective conservation strategy. So that's quite concerning, and yeah, I think the question then becomes, well, why do we care? Why do we care about insects? And I chose this image to go with this sort of topic slide quite carefully. This is a cucurbit flower. It's probably watermelon. And this is a squash bee. And these squash bees are specialists on cucurbit flowers. They'll visit a few other things, but most of the time they're visiting watermelon, squash. They have a close affinity with those flowers. Those other beetles there are striped cucumber beetle. When it comes to like a cucurbit specialist, everything they do is connected to that host plant. They eat that plant. They use it to synthesize mating pheromones and defense compounds. They're only found on cucurbits. They are like strongly associated with cucurbits. And I could just imagine the bee that can go to other things sitting there going, let me tell you how awesome these squash flowers are. And the squash beetle is like, yeah, we know. So there's very much an element that something like this of preaching to the choir, but that doesn't mean that it's not particularly useful to do that. And part of that is because part of the reason why we need to think about this is because how we care about insects impacts how we work to preserve them. And I think that's one of the challenges when we think about those natural areas and how there isn't adequate coverage. Part of that is almost inherent in that approach, that we're going to set aside land somewhere else for insects. And the problem with that is we can't see them day to day in our yard, in our day-to-day activities. And it results in a disconnect between understanding and caring about what we're doing. Yeah. So and there's actually a lot of animosity towards insects. I mentioned mosquitoes earlier. There's 750,000 some deaths, human deaths every year from mosquitoes. So it's not all rosy. There are reasons why people fear insects. There are plenty of insects that are nuisance animals or crop pests. And we have to be realistic that there's sort of a mixed cultural message about insects. A lot of people don't want them in their homes. They don't want them nearby. Not many people in this room, but that's the reality that we're facing. But it's a two-way street. There's also positive cultural messages around insects, probably particularly in New Zealand. I have a hobby of photographing insect statues in New Zealand, and I believe that New Zealand has more insect statues per capita than anywhere else in the world. If you think I'm wrong, then prove it. I'm convinced that this is factual. And of course, the monarch butterflies in particular, despite not being native to New Zealand, strictly speaking, they're certainly a part of our Kiwiana culture, and we take great interest in them, and they're really useful for giving children an experience with insects and starting to build that caring. So this little guy on the left, if you ask him, he'll tell you that he wants to grow up and he wants to be a medical doctor. I have it on good authority that he's going to grow up and become a biologist, and he's going to study monarch butterflies and insect pollination, and end up presenting to the Moths and Butterflies New Zealand Trust. So I'm a little bit slow on the slide advancing, sorry. Yeah, so I actually had the opportunity to study monarchs as part of my master's degree under Doug Tallamy. And he's been a really driving force in sort of encouraging the uptake of gardening for wildlife, particularly in the US. And he's made a really important point there, that the more that we interact with these things, the more we care, and the more we care, the more we're going to do to support them. So he's really onto something there, and there's a lot of reasons for us to care about insects, of course, and some of them they're not all immediately important, but I think we would all agree that insects are just downright beautiful. As an insect photographer, that's something I'm always looking at. The monarch chrysalis is just a marvel to look at. That's not all. These are all some New Zealand examples here. Of course, our stick insects are just these amazing creatures that are really hard to spot, but once you spot them, the detail in their camouflage is just remarkable. This is the New Zealand giraffe weevil. It's Lasiorhynchus barbicornis, and if you break down the Latin roots of those words, it roughly translates to furry face mustache nose. And so that's quite a descriptive name once you drill down, and they've got these fine hairs underneath their long rostrum. Just really cool to look at. Of course, our puriri moths are hard to miss when they're flying around a light at night, getting chased by a ruru moorpork. Just this vivid green, there's nothing quite like that. And even some of the things that we think about as sort of, I don't know, run-of-the-mill, mundane insects. This is the brown blowfly. They're common in most New Zealand environments. But when you look up close, they've just got these beautiful rings of orange hairs and this sort of iridescent blue-black dorsal surface. They're important flower visitors in the bush. They do some crop pollination, but they're actually just beautiful, even though, if you don't think of them that way, it's just another fly buzzing around the living room, but they're actually quite stunning. And of course, we've got our glowworms. If you're in New Zealand, particularly North Island, and you haven't been to Waitomo, you really should go. I'm sensitive to sort of very touristy things, and it is quite touristy, but it's worth it. It's just, there's nothing like it on the rest of the planet. And some of my colleagues from around the world have come to Aotearoa just to go there. If you can't make it to Waitomo, then head down to your local stream down the road at night. and take a torch and then turn it off and stand there for 10 minutes, because they're probably there. These things are really widespread in New Zealand. You don't get the densities that you get in the caves, but there are plenty of streams in Auckland that have these just lining the sides of the streams, and people don't know because they don't go into those bush fragments at night. We just don't. So go have a look. You might be surprised. They're probably there. So yeah, I like insects because they're beautiful. I suspect you do too. There's other reasons why I find insects quite likable and relatable, and some of that is they do stuff that we do. So the classic example here is these are Costa Rican leafcutter ants. They work together in these sort of amazing organizational patterns to go and harvest leaves from plants around in the rainforest, and they carry them back bit by bit to their nests. But they don't eat the leaves, of course. They use them in certain mixtures to farm fungus that they then eat themselves and feed to their larvae. So in that sense, they're very much mushroom farmers. They're doing agriculture, and they've been doing it for longer than we have. So that I find that quite relatable when they're doing these processes that we do to support ourselves. And I was thinking about that, the idea of being mushroom farmer, but I live in the Waikato, so it's mostly dairy farms. So what about animal culture? What about dairying? I didn't know about this until quite recently. I was working in near Brisbane, and we had this rainstorm. And after the rainstorm, suddenly there were ants flying everywhere. Lots of ant species will have these big mating flights after a rainstorm, and the ground's soft, and they can establish new nests. And then I looked quite closely at some of these flying reproductive ants. So that's an ant queen, and she's just dropped her wings. And I thought she was carrying an egg. And I thought that was pretty strange, given that she hadn't started a colony yet. So where would that egg have come from? Then I looked up close, and I saw that egg has little legs underneath it. And what that egg is actually a scale insect. It's a completely different species. And these ants, this is the genus Acropyga, and they actually farm these scale insects in their nests. And to make sure that they have them in their nests, when a queen leaves, she actually picks ones up to seed a new population of these insects in their nest. So she's carrying this thing dutifully around. She'll dig a new nest, and they'll start farming these scale insects down in the nest. And as the queen lays eggs and her offspring start to grow, they'll feed them secretions from the scale insects, and they'll grow the population of scale insects alongside their own colony of sisters. So yeah, quite fascinating. Speaking of sort of growing a family together, this is my son. He'll be 7 months old next week, and he's absolutely wonderful. And that's his lovely mother, Lisa, and she pours so much of her energy into him. He had, like many of us, she's not quite sleeping through the night. She's often really tired, but you can just see that she spends her days doting on him, and he's thriving. And she takes such good care of him that I'm about to make potentially a massive error. And I'm going to say she's such a good mother that I'm going to compare her to a stink bug. That's because just like she's pouring her energy into our little boy, some stink bug species, they do parental care. They take care of their offspring. So this is another Costa Rican bug, but there's stink bugs all over the world that do behaviors like this. And she's laid those eggs, and she's standing over them. And she's not, it looks like she's incubating them like a chicken, but this isn't about thermal regulation. It's actually about defense. So what is she defending those eggs from? The world is a hard place for a baby stink bug. There is a huge diversity of wasps. This one's in the genus Anastatus. And they're not looking to eat the eggs. They're looking to sting them and lay an egg inside. And as that egg develops, they consume the developing stink bug nymph, and they kill it. So these are what we call parasitoids. It's a parasitic lifestyle, but it actually kills the host. That's the difference between a parasite and a parasitoid. And there's heaps of species like this that are trying to lay eggs in the eggs of other insects. They're all really tiny, but there's this whole world of high competition going on. Incidentally, as an aside, I happen to go out at night, and those eggs, some of the stink bug eggs, glow under a UV light. I have no idea why. It's just a wonderful, fascinating, weird world. So if that stink bug were to leave her eggs and go, I don't know, decide to go have a feed somewhere or just have a rest, one of these wasps would go in, sting the eggs, and instead of baby stink bugs, you'd be getting baby wasps. And that's very sad for the stink bug. But it's not necessarily a bad thing. Like that's how these ecosystems stay in balance. This is not actually the egg of that particular stink bug. This is the egg of a global pest species. This is the brown marmorated stink bug. And I used to work with them at the USDA before coming to New Zealand. And this is a major pest. If you've flown into the Auckland International Airport, you will have seen posters for these guys. They inflict major economic damage on a huge number of horticultural crops. And they happen to come into people's homes by the tens of thousands. Once it starts getting cold, they just flock into people's houses. It's a disaster. So in New Zealand, we're really worried about accidentally importing these. But if we do accidentally import them, we've actually tested those wasps to make sure that they will target this species and not most of our native species. And we're ready to go, releasing this actual species of wasp in New Zealand to help keep these guys under control. So throughout the world, there's a whole bunch of insects that are eating a whole bunch of insects, and it has an effect of balancing these populations so we don't get huge outbreaks of pests. And this is something that insects are contributing to us directly. It's not just because they're beautiful. It's not because they have an intrinsic value, even though I would argue that's very important for our own well-being. But they're providing what we call ecosystem services. These are the life support systems of the planet that keep us alive. And one of them is pest control. Insects sort of paradoxically provide pest control of other insects. The other ecosystem service that's often sort of front of mind when the term comes up is pollination. And that happens to be the field that I work in professionally is crop pollination. This is a bumblebee, and it's pollinating a kiwi fruit flower. So that's sort of the fundamental element of the economy in the Eastern North Island is kiwi fruit pollination. It's a big deal if you don't get good pollination on kiwi fruit. And those flowers are only open for about 10 days. So if it rains for 6 of them and then you don't have bees around on the last 4 days, that's a crop failure. They're entirely dependent on pollinators. And you've probably seen some of the factors globally around our food production that suggest that about 1 in 3 mouthfuls is what they say. So every third mouthful of food that you eat is dependent on insect pollination for production of that food. Let's see here. So it's not just kiwi fruit, and it's not just honeybees and bumblebees. These are macadamia flowers. This is taken in Australia, and that's an Australian native species of bee. It's fairly closely related to honeybees, but these things are tiny and they don't have stings. And you can just see that they're actually really closely matched with the pollination, with the form of the flowers of macadamia. Macadamia needs pollen deposited right on the very end of that stigma. The only receptive part of that flower is about the size of a full stop, and it's right on the end. And the stingless bees, when they land on that flower, they crawl out right to the end, and they're interacting with that specific spot on that flower. So they're really good pollinators of macadamia, and a good example of a close fit between plants and the insects that are providing ecosystem services for them. We also have a number of native bee species in New Zealand. This one is in the genus Leiophractus. They can get close to the size of a honeybee. Most of them are probably about half the size of a honeybee. If you just looked quickly, you'd think it was a flying ant, but they have all the features of bees. The main one being that they have the hairs on their body, instead of being like one single hair like we have, they actually have branched hairs. Each hair is like a tree with individual little hairlets coming off of it. And that's one of the things that makes bees such good pollinators, is those branched hairs. are really good at picking up pollen. And that's a critical step for a bee to pick up pollen on one flower or one tree and then move it to another one. Bees, of course, aren't the only pollinators. This is one of my favorite New Zealand species. It's a blue hoverfly, and it actually doesn't look like a hoverfly. That's one of the things I like about it. It looks much more like some of our other groups of flies. It's just a stunningly beautiful creature when you see it up close. And they visit avocado flowers amongst a number of other flowers of native plants and whatnot. So that's a blue hoverfly on an avocado flower. So pollination is one ecosystem service to talk about, but the other one is support of other animals. So as I mentioned before, there's lots of insects eating other insects, and a lot of those insects are ones that we want. This is our native New Zealand mantis, and it's got a hold of a crane fly, and they are entirely dependent on insect protein for their own survival. And they're one of these things that's providing that pest control, but we kind of like them in their own right. They're interesting, and they wouldn't exist if there wasn't enough diverse food sources around for them to consume. It's not just insects eating insects, of course. For many people, just sort of caring about an insect directly is a bit of a step too far. But a lot of people like birds, especially in New Zealand, and birds are massively dependent on insects and arthropods for their survival. So this is a U.S. species. This is taken at a family member's home in New England. These are house wrens. I think Casey's actually here. This is your parents' house. And I was photographing some bees on flowers, and these birds were just chirping at me incessantly, like really angry. And I started watching them, and they were just coming back with all sorts of the spider on the left, one of our little butterflies on the right. And it turns out that I was sitting right by the nest box, and they had little babies in there, and they were busy bringing those insects back. And so wrens eat a lot of insects anyway, in the same way that like I would think of them being kind of like fantails in New Zealand. There's something that's completely dependent on insects. That's most of what they do. But it goes further than that. 96% of terrestrial bird species feed their young with insects and arthropods, almost exclusively. So if you count shorebirds and things, that number drops a bit. But that arthropod protein is immensely important for breeding birds. How does that fit with New Zealand? So I don't know how many insects Karuru eat. I think it's probably not very many. But in that sense, they're very much an exception to the rule. But it's not necessarily intuitive. So our tui, you think, oh, the tui is an iconic bird, especially around Auckland and in the Waikato, but they're everywhere. And we think of them as nectar feeding birds, and that family of birds are called the honey eaters. There's some in Australia, and that's kind of what they do. And yeah, you might think that that's all they do, and they do. They eat a lot of nectar. That's definitely Don Merton, who's the ecologist and conservationist, who's famous for saving the North Island robin. He actually did some work just watching these birds and seeing what they were eating. And tuis spent a lot of their time on flowers. About 81% of their time was on flowers. But that depends on the time of year, and we have some breeding tui around our house, and during the right time of year, if you ask me what tuis eat, I wouldn't say flowers. I would say they're eating kihiki, they're eating cicadas. So this is the chorus cicada. This is the really loud one that you hear sort of late in the summer when the days are hot. But pretty much the smaller cicadas that come out earlier in the year, pretty much as soon as they come out, the tuis go wild chasing them around. I just these acrobatic dog fights between cicadas and the tuis chasing them through the understory. And so I strongly suspect that the juvenile tui at our place are raised on heaps and heaps and heaps of cicadas. The other thing that I see the tui doing, and it's another sort of element of their breeding ecology, is that when birds lay eggs, they have to deposit a whole lot of I'm blanking on some. Anyway, the nutrients required to make that eggshell is extremely demanding, and they actually pull pull it out of their bones, they actually get wobbly legs because they're drawing so much nutrients out of their bones. And I see tui at our place during that season rummaging around in the understory in the leaf litter, and I think what they're doing is eating snails, which have shells that are replenishing the nutrients that they need for eggshells. So the other another bit of work that Don Merton did, just another example, was bellbirds, which are also honey eaters. And he found that in some times a year, they spent up to 99% of their time not on flowers, but on tree trunks and branches. And he predicted that they were hunting for insects. And it's not always evident. You don't always see them catch them. You don't always see the insects. I don't know if anyone can see it on here, but a lot of these things are really cryptic. So there's a caterpillar right in the middle on that tree trunk. I think this is probably Rewa rewa. I don't know what that species of caterpillar is, but it's stunningly camouflaged with the moss and lichens on the tree trunk. It may be eating those mosses and lichens. I don't know if it's eating the tree or if it's eating the mosses, but these things are hidden all over the place, and birds are really good at finding them. So even a bird like a bellbird that we think of as an obligate nectivore is spending heaps of time on the branches and on the leaves, hunting probably for caterpillars. So yeah, we've gone through a bit of an overview of ecosystem services from insects. I left out a slide of my compost bin, which is full of black soldier fly maggots. And that's the other ecosystem service that I think of as insects providing is really important. Is they're important for breaking down waste products, and so there's all sorts of things that we absolutely depend on for insects. But what do we do for them? What can we do for them? And I think everyone here is familiar with the idea of wildlife gardening. I know that the Trust and Jackie have developed lots of resources for encouraging monarchs and other species. There's a good awareness of some of our butterfly species in New Zealand and what their host plants are. I was lucky enough to be part of a project. This is a paper that was published earlier this year, led by Yolanda van Heesek at University of Otago and her colleague Phil Seddon. And they gathered this really great group of ecologists and conservationists and landscape designers, just a number of experts from around New Zealand. And we went through this process of deciding what were the most important elements for encouraging biodiversity in residential properties, so in gardens. And it wasn't just focused on insects. Like, that's clearly part of the reason that I was there was to tell them that we don't know very much about native bees and what they require. But this was sort of across, considering both plant diversity, animal diversity, the whole shebang. And we went through this. They call it a Delphi process, where we sort of went through rounds of feedback, where we sort of brainstormed what the most important elements of a designed garden would be in terms of supporting biodiversity. And then once we had identified what those were, we went through a process of sort of almost doing like would you rather questions, and use those to statistically analyze what the most important elements were in a garden. So that paper's out and published. And there were a few things that came out of this process of what were the most important things. So the top priority for gardens was habitat quality, and that was contained in a number of elements. But the thing to remember about habitat quality is that all of the energy in terrestrial ecosystems, or very nearly all of it, is solar energy, and the only way it moves up the food chain is through photosynthesizing plants. So plants really provide the foundation of terrestrial food webs and our own survival. So one of the things that came out of the study was that the biomass of plants was hugely important, and not just the biomass, but also sort of connectivity and diversity. So if I had to break down sort of the elements of of habitat quality that we discussed into one word, I would say it would be complexity. It's having multiple layers of complex habitat. So large trees with a understory of medium trees and a shrub layer, and then a complex ground cover is probably the best thing for the widest array of species that depend on them. So this is something that I've tried to do. I've shown some of you this slide before. So this is a house this is where I lived before coming to New Zealand, and that front space was all grass when we moved in. But what we did was we planted this diverse, both structurally and species diverse garden in the front. It was a lot of work, but it was doable. This wasn't all we were doing, and we watched as species were recruited to this environment over several years. So the thing that we did here was we basically added complexity into this landscape, and it's easy to think about sort of garden space in a two-dimensional way. That's sort of the way that humans think about stuff, because we're usually stuck on the ground. So when you buy a house, you look at the square meterage of the floor plan. But just think about how you would decorate your house differently if you weren't constrained by gravity and you could put your kitchen table on the ceiling. And if you were a bird or an insect, that's very much how you would look at it. It's not just the two-dimensional area, it's the three-dimensional space. So in this sense, we had these canopy trees around the house, where the amount of area available for forage, available for nesting was enormous compared to the sort of more two-dimensional meadow garden. And even the meadow garden, the complexity, the spatial complexity there was enormous compared to the grass, and then again a step beyond the driveway. So that's also one of the things that was sort of co-rated quite highly by the experts was both the quality of the habitat, which included measures of complexity, but also the extent. So the more area that you dedicate to plantings instead of impermeable surfaces or grass, the more valuable to wildlife that space is going to be. The other element of quality that's really important, and this is again something that's quite familiar to you, is host plant choice. It's not just enough to have complex plants. We need to have plants that share an evolutionary history with the animals that we're trying to support, especially with insects. Most chewing insects, especially, most insects generally, but especially chewing insects, are specialists on just one or two lineages of plants. So they might eat, like monarchs, they're eating two genera, Asclepias and Gomphocarpus. It's all quite closely related, and they're really close. They're really evolved to deal with the plant defenses that are in place on those plants. So this is a monarch in the U.S. on Asclepias syriaca, and that's the most, in my mind, the most clear illustration of that interaction. Like most of the milkweeds, it's filled with that sticky latex sap that looks like PVA glue, and it's under pressure. And that's the first plant defense that's there, is that if a monarch carelessly bites into that plant, it's getting a face full of that sticky sap, and it can actually bind their mouth parts together and kill them. And this is particularly true with small caterpillars. So you'll see this on swan plant as well. The first thing that happens when an egg hatches is they chew that little circular trench around their egg. And that's not actually feeding. What that's doing is breaking the vascular connections in the leaf so that it relieves the pressure of that sap, and they're less likely to get a lethal face full of sticky stuff. Once the caterpillars relieve the pressure on that leaf, it's going to crawl out to the end, and it's going to start feeding from the end of the leaf inwards to avoid that sticky sap. The other thing it's got to deal with, of course, is cardiac glycoside. So in addition to the sap, these plants are loaded with toxic compounds. If you were to make a milkweed salad, first, it would taste awful. You probably wouldn't get very far. If you somehow managed to consume it, you would then feel really, really unwell. And if you manage to hold it down, it would stop your heart. They're called cardiac glycosides because they interfere with the sodium potassium pumps that are the basis of nervous system function. So cardiac glycosides are lethal to most vertebrates, and that's but monarchs have evolved organs where they are able to put those compounds aside and save them for their own defense. So monarchs are extremely specialized on this plant lineage, but they're not the only specialized insects. Most insects are specialized. This is something that my team has been working on in agricultural settings, is trying to get a better understanding of which beneficial New Zealand insects are connected to which native plants. So this is a very complex graph. This is, I told you I wouldn't include many of these, but on the top, these are our native plants. And the width of those black bars kind of reflects how many native species, sorry, not just native species, but these are bee and fly species are associated with those plants. This isn't necessarily through herbivory. These are adults, so it's suggesting that those plants contribute to habitat for these species, but it doesn't necessarily tell us why. These insects are probably visiting flowers on those plants, and they may be living in the they're certainly living in the environment around them, but they may not actually be eating those plants exactly. But there are a number of host specialists that are known in New Zealand. This is the same insect on the front slide, and this is the cabbage tree moth. And the only thing that cabbage tree moth eats is cabbage tree leaves. And you'll see, I very rarely see the caterpillars, but you'll see the damage. They cut these little like hole punch holes in the leaves, and they're so closely tied to cabbage tree that they have this sort of camouflage where their wing bars align really nicely with the leaf veins on a dried cabbage tree leaf. This photo is like a 1 in a million. Joked with some other ecologists that they've got this nice pattern, but they clearly don't have a method for orienting themselves with it. Most of the time when I see them, they're sitting on a bright green leaf, or they're sitting with their own wings with the leaf veins parallel to, or perpendicular to the leaf veins on the leaf. So they're not always lined up just like this, but pretty close host association for a common and lovely moth in New Zealand. This is the mahoe stripper. The adults are these beautiful green moths. The caterpillars have this awesome like orange speckled appearance. These only eat mahoe, and you won't find them on any other plant. And you typically won't find them unless you go out at nighttime. This is the Kanuka looper. New Zealand has a lot of loopers. It's a family of caterpillars, and they're really difficult to identify as larvae. And they're hard to find. They're really good twig mimics. They usually just kind of sit with their head back, looking like a branch. But if you won't get these moths if you don't have Kanuka and Manuka around. They're common enough plants, but they're absolutely necessary for those butterflies. Sorry, for those moths. So there's heaps. One of the things that we do to increase habitat quality in our gardens is by making sure that we have a diversity of plants, largely native plants that are going to support the herbivorous larvae of these animals. Because I'm a pollination person, I wanted to talk a little bit about other things that people do to manage wildlife in their gardens. And this is one of the other. This is actually the least important category identified by the advisory group for that Garden Star survey, is what we do to encourage wildlife in our gardens directly. So things like feeding sugar water to tuis, something that a lot of people do. It may be somewhat beneficial, but there's risks associated with feeding wildlife with disease spread and whatnot. And I get asked a lot about those little bee hotels that you'll find them in Bunnings or wherever, and they're usually they're stuffed with bamboo, hollowed out bamboo sections in a little house. And I don't want to say that they don't do anything, because they certainly, in one sense, provide structural complexity in a garden setting. But most of our bees, so people are targeting bees, and all of our native bees, like this is a mask-faced bee, and in the genus Hylaeus, and most of them are actually nesting in much smaller apertures than you see This one is sort of narrowed down the aperture in this one, but most of them probably nest in grass stems. So rather than buying a bee house, you'd be much better off, if you want native bees, you'd be much better off planting a native grass or a shrub that has sort of pithy stems, and these things will be living in those tiny little hollowed out stems. Most of our native bees in New Zealand are what we call ground nesting bees, and they're digging these holes into the soil. They look like anthills, but if you watch them long enough, if there's things flying in and out, even if they look like ants, if they're flying in and out, they're not ants. They're native bees. So these are actually, this is an aggregation in Whangarei on the left. It's an extraordinarily dense aggregation. You're much more likely to see individual holes and maybe a couple holes together. You won't always see big groups of them like this. And yeah, we're actually just starting on a 3-year project to try to learn more about what the habitat requirements of our native bees are. And that's both for managing them for conservation and to try to use them in a more targeted way for crop pollination. The fun thing is if you manage to get a population of bees in your garden, so probably the best thing you can do for bees is to make sure you leave a little bit of bare ground. So when we talk about complexity, that can be complexity in ground cover. There's heaps of New Zealand insects that really need leaf litter. They need that moist environment, including a lot of our moths. A lot of our moths have a sort of dual life cycle where they spend a year or 6 months or so feeding on decomposing leaves on the ground, and then they crawl up onto their host plant and start that second phase. So leaf litter is really important. But if you want bees, you probably want to have a mix with both leaf litter or decomposing logs and things and some bare ground for bee nests. And we're working on trying to figure out, what affects how quickly they find that patch of habitat. Because just because you have a patch of bare ground doesn't mean you'll have native bees. Once you have native bees, you'll start to see this whole trophic cascade of things around bees. So this is a wasp, and it's a gasteropid wasp, and they are amazing at finding these bee holes, and they actually are nest kleptoparasites. So they'll actually lay an egg down in the bee nest, and just like those stink bug parasitoids, these wasps are their larvae is going to take over the bee nest and consume the bees and make more wasps. So there's a balance between the bees and these wasps. And sometimes there's so many of these wasps with these big aggregations, it's surprising that any of the bees survive at all, but they're kind of amazing in their own right. So yeah, the bigger picture here, this is Auckland on a not north to south, if it's not familiar. And this sort of circles back to those protected areas, that concept of somewhere else. There's such a huge opportunity. These are all suburbs, and Auckland's a fairly green city, but looking at this, you can see the potential if everyone is gardening with these concepts in mind. There's such a potential for connectivity between habitat patches, and if we're careful about what we plant, we can target certain species, and we can have a huge impact on the carrying capacity of Auckland for our native species, and we would expect that there would be knock-on positive effects in terms of ecosystem services across the board. And the great thing about doing this in a home garden is you don't have the same sorts of constraints that we have in farmland, for example. So we need farms. Most farms are not great at supporting wildlife. We're working on methods to improve the biodiversity on farmland, but we still have to work within the constraints of farm management. Those constraints are a lot different in a residential setting. So there's things that you wouldn't want to do, but by and large, this is New Zealand, there's not a lot of dangerous animals here. So if you can get the support of your neighbors, there's a lot that we can do to improve biodiversity over a very large area. So on that note, that sort of coming off of the Garden Star paper and the survey methods we developed there are actually designed to be carried out by people with an ecological background. There's sort of some specialist metrics involved in that. And the hope is that we'll find ways of implementing that through councils. It was sort of developed is inspired by the home star ratings, where you can new build homes will be assessed for their sustainability elements, and you'll get like a star rating that tells you whether or not that home is going to be energy efficient or not. But there was nothing that would sort of talk about the sustainability of the outside space in those homes. So this is sort of a partner to the Home Star program that's talking about the garden instead of the house itself. So we're Yolanda and Phil are working with several councils and several groups to try to implement this in a formalized way, where people can sort of get certified and sort of advertise that that's what they're doing. The good news is that the Moths and Butterflies Trust has been way ahead of the game there, where I know that there's resources available for guiding development of wildlife gardens, and I think you've got a certification scheme as well. So while this is working its way through councils and whatnot, Yolanda's actually developed a sort of homeowner-centric way of scoring the property. And so, yeah, if you follow that link, this is available through the People, Cities, and Nature webpage, and you can download this fact sheet and actually calculate the score by yourself. Don't be disappointed if it's not 100% of the ones that they tested. They trialed this program in a number of houses, and I think the highest score was 53. So and that's good. That tells us that we're doing pretty well, but there's always room for improvement. So don't be too sad if you get a low score, but yeah, I'd encourage you to download this, spread it through the trust. Really useful tool for assessing what we're doing for diversity in those landscapes. And just a sort of final thought, it's not always easy living as part of our local ecology. This is a giant centipede. The bush around our house has grown up to the point where we're starting to get things that you wouldn't necessarily expect to have around the house. So the New Zealand giant centipedes, this is a baby one, but it's still about the size of my hand. And those are my son's diapers. So I was changing his diaper and picked up one of the little diapers, and this thing had obviously crawled in the window and fallen into the little bucket where the diapers are. So it gave me a bit of a shock. And the other thing that happened a few years ago was something nipped me while I was sleeping. You had the window open and something nipped me on the back. And I'm an entomologist, but I'm still susceptible to alarm from this. So I jumped out of bed, probably screamed, and looked, and unfortunately there was a weta that had crawled in the window and somehow gotten underneath me and been smashed on the bed. And Lisa asked me if it was there's two different families of weta. There's cave weta and there's tree weta. And she asked me if it was a cave weta or a tree weta, and I told her that it was a bed weta. And so I'll leave you. It's not always easy, but we must share our spaces with these ecosystems that support our well-being. And it's imperative that we do it, but it's also really exciting that so many people are engaged with it. So I'll leave you with the thoughts of one of my heroes, Edward Wilson, who says that there can be no purpose more inspiring than to begin the age of restoration, reweaving the wondrous diversity of life that still surrounds us. So thank you very much for your time on a sunny Sunday. And yeah, thank you.